afternoon, everyone. Louder? Good afternoon, everyone. And welcome to our third keynote speech by David Howarth and Jason Glynos, in which they will talk about the logics in these past 12 years, the challenges it's faced, and its future trajectories. When setting out to write this book, David and Jason noted that the task of writing a book is, as Michel Foucault said, best practiced as an intellectual adventure with no guaranteed outcome or destination. The logics of critical explanation in social and political theory is no exception. This book is without a doubt a testament of Jason and David's preoccupation for offering an approach by which political discourse theory could engage with empirical research. In a way, this piece of work represents the culmination of their work towards advancing an understanding of critical political theory, which needs not clash with empirical research, but that rather is strengthened by it. David and Jason's work lead us to see that as theorists, we need not to choose one or the other, but that critique and empirics are two sides of the same coin. This is something that, of course, continues to characterize Jason and David's work, and I can say so not only by knowing their work, but by having the great opportunity of working with them. As our supervisors, David and Jason neither let us forget the critical nor the empirical. We are told that we must not lose sight of the nuances of critique, but we must also not leave aside the fact that the theory we do is set to live in the real world, the empirical realm. I know I can safely speak for the whole of the IDA PhD collective when I say that we feel very, very fortunate to be able to have them as our supervisors. The collective work that we have done in the past years is a testament of how their concern for a critical ethos lives not only in their theory, but also in their mentorship. Thank you, David and Jason, once again, not only for the support for this conference, but for the continuous support for our research. So without further ado, I hand the floor to David, followed by Jason. Immediately followed by our last plenary session by our discussant, Karen West, Jenny Gunnarsson Payne, and Hugh Wilmott. And we will open the room for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you again for that great introduction. So I'd like to begin by thanking all the organizers for their fantastic efforts in initiating and assembling this amazing conference that we're having at the moment. And thanks for inviting Jason and I to speak at your event. Thanks also to all of the many paper givers and for the wonderful discussions that have unfolded here over the last couple of days. The big problem with all these intense discussions and critical engagements is that it leaves us with precious little to say. And following the keynotes of Chantal and Jody, we've got a hard act to follow. But we'll give it a go. So since the publication of Logics of Critical Explanation in 2007, I have used the approach to try and examine the politics of large-scale infrastructure projects, mainly focused on plans to expand and build airports in different contexts, to explore some of the impacts of fiscal austerity on urban collaborative governance in different cities since the global financial crisis, and to add some more flesh to the social ontology of post-Marxist discourse theory. But my strategy in addressing the topic today has led me to reactivate a few of the core ideas of the Logics book and to consider various criticisms that have been leveled at the approach, while reflecting upon some of the pressing challenges for future research and engagement. After these more general remarks, Jason will focus on the role of psychoanalytical categories, as well as some questions about populism. Just a pause, I've got the wrong spectacles here. I can't see things very well. Apologies for that. But if you can excuse the indulgence, and Emilio has said I can indulge, I shall begin with a few contextualizing remarks. When I arrived here at Essex to study with Ernesto in the mid-1980s, the Essex School of Discourse Analysis was gathering steam around Ernesto's and Chantal's path-breaking hegemony and socialist strategy. We were immersed in a rapidly developing approach to social and political analysis, in which the Marxist tradition was subjected to an intense conversation with post-structuralist, psychoanalytic, hermeneutical, and post-analytical themes. The focus was on the construction of new concepts and logics, which in turn was shaped by the eruption of new identities and social movements, the growing hegemony of the new right, and a world that was on the cusp of the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of apartheid, a new wave of democratization, and the consolidation of global neoliberalism. In a politically more pluralistic universe, where intense practical and theoretical debates about Marxism, socialism, democracy, and the future of the left dominated, methodological issues lagged behind the elaboration of new theoretical grammars and languages. As research students, we embraced the excitement of new times and the liberations of transdisciplinary and interdisciplinary research, which effortlessly spanned the fields of social and political theory, linguistics, philosophy, literary theory, psychoanalysis, history, and much else besides. 100 flowers and 100 schools of thought did indeed seem to bloom before our eyes. But we were also aware of more mundane matters, such as writing our PhD theses, conducting our fieldwork and empirical research, publishing articles and papers, and most importantly perhaps, dealing with an imperceptibly changing academic world. In the 1980s and 1990s, we conceptualized the issue in terms of the so-called application problem. How is it possible to apply the new concepts and logics to empirical phenomena? What were the appropriate research strategies and analytical techniques for conducting discourse analysis? The Logics book emerged in a different conjuncture. It was marked by our positions within a department of government that increasingly championed a very particular conception of political science, with the emphasis very much on science, and a university system that was undergoing rapid change by the installation of neoliberal logics such as competition, marketization, and atomization. This was evident both in terms of the role of positive explanatory theory, which was viewed as a paradigmatic and largely based on quantitative and formal models of analysis, and a conception of critical theory, which was understood to be exclusively analytical, normative, Anglo-American, and liberal. And while, of course, this growing hegemony of positivism and liberal normativism across the social sciences was challenged by voices like the perestroika movement in political science, as well as a proliferation of minority and counter-hegemonic voices within and outside the academy, the danger was that this trend would become completely dominant. Our fears were that in the battle for the future of the humanities and the social sciences, it would be horses against tanks. The Logics book thus took aim at the emerging consensus in the social sciences, and with it the belief that the search for causal explanations and descriptions completely exhausted political inquiry. It was organized around the device of two alleged deficits, the methodological and the normative, and sought to address a core number of key research questions. Can we develop an approach that respects the self-interpretation of social actors while not reducing explanations to their subjective viewpoints alone? Is it possible to have a type of explanation that admits of a certain generality, provides a space for critique, and yet respects the specificity of the empirical cases being investigated? And can we affirm a notion of critique that avoids liberal normativism while countering allegations that post-Marxist discourse theory is merely a form of negative critique, or even worse, a dangerous form of neoconservatism? So, the Logics book is thus unashamedly a methodological text. Now, it has been noted that Ernesto often took a cavalier approach and a rather skeptical attitude to questions of method, narrowly construed, and his interests were plainly more theoretical and conceptual in nature. In conversation and lectures, Ernesto would often invoke Paul Feyerabend's famous or infamous opposition to method, so as to highlight the futility of formalizing the scientific method as a well-defined procedure, and he admired his anything-goes anarchist philosophy of science. Indeed, Leclerc, in my view, was correct to cast doubt on method as a kind of silver bullet which can resolve all questions about the value, purpose, and way of conducting research in the humanities and social sciences. However, we sought to place the question of method in a much wider horizon. The logics approach is designed to furnish the conditions and means to elaborate critical explanations of problematized social phenomena. Its overall aim is to adduce and piece together particular narratives that can render intelligible or explain a puzzling feature of a practice or regime. And this can be accomplished by assembling a credible body of evidence and facts that can be tested in terms of their fit and consistency by a relevant tribunal of critical scholars and practitioners. Starting with the complex practice of problematization, detecting a puzzle or a worry in a practice or theorization, the form of explanation is retroductive rather than just inductive or deductive, while the content of any putative explanans is couched in terms of logics rather than laws, mechanisms, or self-interpretations. In other words, while an explanation ought to take an actor's own meanings, reasons, or affects into account, it does not simply reflect their self-interpretations. Instead, an explanation involves the articulation of different logics that govern or compose a practice or regime. More precisely, the logic of a practice or regime captures the rules that structure it, as well as the objects and conditions that make the operation of such rules possible and vulnerable to change. And Jason and I identified three kinds of logics: social, political, and phantasmatic, each of which is rooted in an ontology marked by radical contingency. Harnessed together, we believe they can be used to develop answers about the character and grip of problematized practices, as well as their overall purposes, meanings, and effects. Now, one immediate challenge focuses on the whereabouts of discourse in this approach. What and where exactly does discourse fit into this research strategy? One simple way to answer this question is to clarify the category of discourse. For us, discourse is not just about patterns of meaning, texts or symbolic representations narrowly construed, but is best viewed as an articulatory practice that links together and modifies elements, natural and cultural, physical and linguistic, into relational systems. The articulation of such elements yields incomplete social systems, which are always marked by an outside that is caused by the exercise of power and exclusion. And such elements are radically contingent, for it is only in this way that they can be constructed in different ways by competing forces and political projects. So our aim is thus to explore the logics of articulatory practices or regimes, that is, discourses, by discerning their rules and conditions of possibility. Social logics are not reducible to the self-interpretations of actors or textual logics, but have to be discerned through a retroductive and interpretive practice, which matches words and actions on the one hand with the rules that give rise to them. So discourses are not just talk or text, but social practices that crystallize and embody logics, and logics can then be captured by detecting the rules and the objects that condition what can be said or done and not be said and done in a particular frame or context, and they can be further tested by considering further related phenomena. But then this leads immediately to questions that have been raised about the nature of social logics themselves, and more precisely about the role of economic structures and practices, or materiality, organizations, and institutions more generally. The first thing to say here is that while such social logics are thoroughly contextual and historical, their discernment and analysis requires theoretical presuppositions. In order to account for problematized phenomena, we thus need categories to flesh out the empirical case studies they make possible. Here, the challenge is to continue to elaborate new concepts within post-structuralist discourse theory while mining adjacent theoretical fields and traditions. Such traditions include, for example, the resources of French regulation theory, neo-Gramscian state theory, radical political economy, critical management studies, media studies, interpretive policy analysis, political geography, the burgeoning literatures on governmentality, not to mention the proliferating schools' varieties of discourse analysis. In equal measure, though, we need to think about the conditions and implications of such articulations. So the fourfold practices of reactivation, deconstruction, commensuration, and articulation can help us to avoid the twin dangers of eclecticism or subsumption in carrying out this task. And once historicized and deconstructed, we can therefore add concepts like regimes of accumulation, modes of regulation, logics of financialization, strategies of governmentality, communicative capitalism to the arsenal of weapons we can deploy in the logics approach. In practice, we also know that social logics are political and ideological constructions too. So the concrete empirical research must be directed at tracing out their emergence via moments of contestation and institution. Critics and users often raise questions about how social, political, and phantasmatic logics can be distinguished and then used in tandem. Our first response here is to stress that these are analytical separations that are rooted in a relational social ontology, where the social/political and the ethical/ideological dimensions are inextricably intertwined in practice. The isolation and operation of logics is thus part of an analytical strategy that can highlight different aspects of social phenomena. But our critical explanations seek to link them together again in a synthesis of many determinations. I think we can also formulate a related response to critics who raise questions about the practical techniques and research strategies that can enable us to operationalize the logics approach. Although there is insufficient time to develop our thoughts in detail here now, we may return to this question in the discussion and in the final panel discussions we're going to have. One further and rather big elephant in the room, though, is the problem of causality. It is not too much of an exaggeration to say that causality and its relation to prediction was a key problem, if not the key problem, that stimulated the emergence of the logics approach. Of course, the problem of causality is highly tricky and complex. So any initial thoughts about this challenge are experimental and circumspect. Now, it might be thought at the outset that the logics approach is incompatible with any form of causal analysis and explanation. In Foucault and Laclau, for example, we see types of analysis that move from facts and phenomena to their conditions of possibility and existence. Though it must be said, this does not necessarily rule out any form of causal analysis. Moreover, our stress on overdetermination foregrounds the symbolic dimension of social relations, and so eschews causal language, including multi-causality. Such presuppositions seem to push us towards acausal approaches with their exclusive stress on understanding reasons and interpretations. And at the same time, a core object of logics was to challenge mainstream positivists and realists who claimed that explanation was synonymous with causal explanation. Instead, we argued that the concept of causality is contested and multidimensional, and explanation was not reducible to an essentialist and determining notion of causality. We thus contested law-like, linear, efficient, or mechanistic conceptions, as well as a necessary link between explanation and causality. Instead, we emphasized the notion of explanation that embraced description, characterization, interpretation, and the search for understanding more generally. So in challenging dominant accounts of causality, we endeavored to avoid subsumptive and reductionist approaches, to highlight the complex and relational character of articulatory practices and regimes, and to respect the role of reasons, self-interpretations, and meanings in developing our empirical stories. But inevitably, there are some interesting remainders. The language games that we can play with the concepts of cause and causality are numerous and diverse. Many of the narratives that we construct to answer our problems are often couched in causal terms, if only implicitly, and rely upon causal concepts and categories. Such relations and connections need to be explicated and their theoretical status clarified. Secondly, some of our core concepts and categories carry significant causal connotations. we only have to think about notions like dislocation, the primacy of the political, the logics of equivalence and difference, and the core determinants of subjectivity when cast in terms of the object cause of desire, to use Lacanian terms. Finally, our problematizations are regularly prompted by the desire to answer a series of how and why questions about the phenomena we investigate. In an important sense, therefore, the focus on causes is a core puzzle-disclosing practice, though our actual examination of the phenomena will be shaped by how and what we look for in such exercises. In turn, this endeavor is shaped by our particular languages and conceptions of causality. Now, such practices resonate with other anti-essentialist and pluralistic models of causality. Simplifying considerably, we can focus our attention here on the analysis of systems and events. With respect to systems or regimes, our approach shares a strong family resemblance with structural or emergent models of causality, which seek to capture the imminent production and transformation of historical blocks and formations without recourse to linear, efficient, and mechanistic grammars of causality. Such models help us to theorize the fact that discourses are not just relational structures of difference, but are constitutively marked by absences and dislocations, which are then forged and reconstituted by contending political forces. Systems are relational and differential, as we know, but such relations and differences are constituted by politics and power, the logic of hegemony, in a complicated series of relays and feedback loops. The trick here is to describe the novelty or otherwise of these disruptions and recompositions through the application of the logic's approach, while remaining open to thinking and acting creatively on new possibilities. Moreover, following the work of Bill Connolly in his later writings, and depending on the puzzles and questions we ask, we also need to connect the particular systems that we are analyzing to a whole host of adjacent and interacting systems and force fields, social and natural, so as to deepen our materialist and relational stories of particular phenomena. The focus on the production and transformation of systems also goes hand in hand with the causal analysis of events and their effects. Here, we must attend to those dislocatory moments that condition, though never determine, the emergence of new systems and practices. But we must also disclose the subtle molecular shifts, symptoms, and minute deviations, often occluded or repressed in the dominant readings and ideologies, which can disclose new lines of flight. The challenge here is to characterize the events that disrupt symbolic orders and to register their effects. It is a task that requires careful interpretation, subtle diagnosis and situated judgment. For it is only retrospectively that we can determine their meaning and import. We need the historian's guile and craft, as well as the genealogist's sensitivity, operating in the actual world of practices, to disentangle genuine causal connections from mere concomitants, while detecting and complicating the subtle inversions and reversals between cause and effect. In short, then, the task for our approach is to carefully trace out the processes, trajectories, and logics that emerge from complex fields of dispersed events, remaining attentive to political struggles and ideological displacements. I turn now to the role of critique and evaluation. Practices of characterization and explanation on the one hand, and critique and normative evaluation on the other, are often depicted as disconnected, discrete, and externally related to one another, as well as the objects they explain or evaluate. In contrast, the logic's approach posits a continuous, immanent, and complex connection between our critical explanations and our ethico-political critiques and ethical judgments, even though the latter are not logically deduced or derived from the former. Instead, they flow from our particular ontological commitments, problematizations, and characterizations. The logic's approach thus shares a strong family resemblance with the immanent and complex critique conducted by the later Marx, which Sheila Ben Habib has nicely resolved into its immanent and defetishizing moments. We thus seek to demystify and denaturalize the underlying logics of capitalist relations and the concentrations of power and wealth that they bring about and sustain, thus running counter to our ontological and normative assumptions. So ethical critique demands detailed analyses of the fantasies that underpin our social and political practices, and the enjoyments they procure, and the ways in which phantasmatic objects can be destabilized or modulated. By contrast, questions of normativity are directed at the concrete relations of domination in which subjects are positioned. Normative questions, thus, require the analyst to characterize those relations, institutions, and policies deemed to be oppressive, exploitative, or unfair in the name of alternative values and principles. Two elements come into play here. First, there are the values we bring to any interpretation, as well as the tasks of justification and clarification. But secondly, we must pinpoint and remain attentive to those new values and identities encountered in the practices that are interpreted. Such counter-logics must themselves be evaluated in terms of their own internal standards and our contestable values and ideals. Indeed, they may lead us to revise the normative grounds of our judgments and justifications as well. But what, then, are the core values that should inform our normative evaluations today? What are the grounds of such evaluations? In Hegemony and Social Strategy, Laclau and Mouffe proposed a new hegemonic project to confront the emergent neoliberalism of the new right. In their words, the aim of this project was, quote, not to renounce liberal democratic ideology, but on the contrary to deepen and extend it in the direction of a radical and plural democracy. It was designed to deconstruct the orthodox Marxist model of change, which involves a revolutionary break with a particular mode of production led by a fundamental social class, such as the proletariat, in order to achieve a fully emancipated and transparent system, such as communism. As Chantal put it yesterday, set against aggregative, deliberative, and some agonistic models of democratic politics, yet also profiting from the gains of the democratic revolution, radical democracy involves a deepening and an extension of the values and ideals of democracy, equality, freedom, solidarity, justice, and so on, into ever-widening sites and spaces. So faced today with the dangers of climate chaos and resurgent forms of right-wing nationalism and populism, set against the global hegemony of neoliberal capitalism, there is once again fierce debate about the goals, the agents, and the processes of radical social change. Projects affirming left-wing populism, neo-communism, eco-egalitarian capitalism, and others have all been named, elaborated, and promoted by various traditions of thought and practice. Each jostles to justify and ground our interventions, movements, and organizations. In this new context, there is little doubt that radical Democrats are living in uncomfortable times. The value of democracy has been affirmed and attacked from unusual quarters. When extremist politicians like Nigel Farage clothe themselves in the language of democracy and popular self-government, as he did so in the recent EU elections, then the very idea of democracy looks compromised, if not mortally wounded. And when right-wing populists win elections and referendums, peddling fake news and racist propaganda, we instinctively question the value of mass democracy in an age of communitive capitalism, to use Jodi's apt characterization. For their part, mainstream parties and state institutions regularly seek to bypass democratic practices and processes in the name of technocratic and rational solutions to dilemmas and problems. Indeed, such logics of depoliticization give succor to right-wing populists and nationalists, who are adept at pitting themselves against the rule of experts and faceless bureaucrats who supposedly ignored the demands of the sovereign people. At the same time, a range of thinkers on the left have attacked democracy as a mere buttress of capitalism or as a real obstacle to anti-capitalist struggles. For them too, liberal democratic institutions can also depoliticize central issues in the name of rational and technocratic solutions. Yet, it is still my view that the project of radical democracy arms us with the critical resources to engage in an ethico-political critique and normative evaluation of the current regimes, and to offer an interim vision to overcome the new anti-democratic challenges that we confront. Today, building on Laclau and Mouffe, radical democracy is best viewed as an undecidable, agonistic, and complex space of tension that crystallizes three things: a more or less universal and formal system of rules, procedures, and institutions that can govern the operation of the political system in a fair way. Secondly, the cultivation of a democratic subjectivity, which embodies an ethos of openness and agonistic respect. And third, the articulation of political agencies or forces that can actively contest relations of domination and oppression in various places in the name of democratic ideals and principles. It is important to stress here that this conception does not equate democracy with liberal democratic institutions, though it does not support the abandonment of values like political equality, human rights, and the rule of law, as well as virtues like tolerance, presumptive generosity, and agonistic respect that can help us to build a democratic subjectivity. Equally, radical democracy should not be presented as antithetical to politics and the construction and mobilization of collective identities. Radical democracy is not a form of anti-politics or anti-populism, but is intimately linked to the logic of hegemony. So the radicalization and extension of values like equality, freedom, and justice beyond the institutions of parliament, government, and the state into the economy, civil society, family, university, and other social sites is now more pressing than ever. Indeed, recent movements and demands show that a fundamental object of the logic of radical democratization is increasingly focused on questions about who owns and controls capital, as well as the organization and structure of the key institutions of the capitalist economy. The call for greater economic democracy, the application of democratic principles of popular sovereignty to any and every form of social action, including industry and the economy, as G.D.H. Cole put it many decades ago, is back on the agenda of political parties and movements. Whereas the projects of state socialism and social democracy were found wanting in crucial respects, the logic of economic democracy is now a more feasible and desirable alternative. And going hand in hand with the democratization of capital and ownership are new demands for the devolution and decentralization of power and control from a centralized state capitalism to local communities, regions, and nations. Taken together, such demands are vital components of an incipient radical democratic project, which is crucial for contesting the concentrations of power and wealth that arise from the combined and uneven development of capitalist relations. Of course, the project for radical democracy faces acute challenges. How can its ideals and principles be implemented and sustained? How can the hard cases that accompany the concrete realization of emancipatory projects be negotiated in a democratic way? And how can democratic and political forces navigate, quote, the difference between a strategy of opposition and a strategy for the construction of a new order? Indeed, one of the biggest challenges for new popular movements is to transform themselves from a vibrant politics of protest into an effective and democratic instrument of governance, while still remaining their radical and democratizing edges. And there are other challenges too. How can the myth of a new beginning, the end of austerity and self-defeating debt, be transformed into new collective social imaginaries? Are problems like climate change and immigration, which span the local, national, and global, amenable to democratic resolution? And in what ways can we render supranational organizations like the EU more responsive to a greater range of interests, identities, and demands? How can we democratically design democratic institutions that can help us to instill a democratic subjectivity? These are just some of the deep and pressing issues in our current conjuncture. Yet it is still our conviction, now more than ever, that the project of radical democracy is crucial both to defend the democratic institutions and processes we have struggled to create, and to extend its principles, values, and ethos to greater areas of our collective social lives. One of the core challenges in the university, and for those who subscribe to our versions of critical political theory, is thus to put more flesh on the bones of this democratizing project, and then to project its commitments and tasks into our theoretical labors, empirical applications, and practical endeavors. Thank you.
Right. Can people hear? It's on. Excellent. Thank you again to the organizers, and I'm sure people are going to get tired of me saying that, but we will say it again. Of course, these inhuman Karen and so on, but I will repeat myself a bit later as well. And also thanks to David for this introduction, to situate and to contextualize the logics approach. Apart from asking us to present something of an overview of discourse theory and the logics approach, its achievements to date, and the many challenges that remain, which David has just done, our organizing collective also asked us to comment on some themes and questions not only connected to the conference, but also connected to our work as we are undertaking it now. As regards the conference, let me just start my... there are, of course, too many things to comment on, but there are several things worth mentioning. One thing I take away from these 2 days is a recognition of a new urgency being injected into addressing questions linked to the market and the economy more generally, the logics of gender and gendering, media logics and their role of rhetoric, particularly social media logics and their affinities with the radical and alt-right, as well as a whole array of logics of organization and governance. There was also a strong interest evident in revisiting how discourse theory connects up with new materialism debates, and of course new research strategies that draw on corpus linguistics and visual methodologies. Also noticeable from the conference, but not just from the conference, is a renewed urgency in attempts to tackle the question of populism, but in a rather paradoxical way. It seems to me that efforts are apparent in many such interventions in and around populism to lay down the groundwork not so much for more sophisticated accounts of populist phenomena and how to study them, of course this continues apace, but also to forge pathways leading us away from populism, but without necessarily abandoning the attention we give to populism. And I'm going to say something more about this shortly under the title Critical Populist Studies, where I will make the argument that populism studies might be understood best in the guise of a kind of vanishing mediator. But before doing so, I want to say that I was also both struck and, I would say, hugely inspired by the strong emphasis in many panels and papers during the conference on the role that key psychoanalytic categories can play in continuing to consolidate and open up new pathways for critical, empirical, and theoretical research within a post-structuralist frame. In particular, the category of fantasy. So the title chosen for my second group of remarks tries to capture something about this mood. The title, in other words, Critical Fantasy Studies. The reason for adding the qualification critical in critical populism studies and critical fantasy studies is in part to set up some resonances with the idea of critical explanation that underpins the logics approach that David has just outlined. However, the focus of the remarks that follow are less on logics themselves and more on what the development of the logics approach has helped me see more clearly. And I mean this in the sense not only of better appreciating the insights and virtues of some key ideas in post-structuralist discourse theory in general, I also mean it in the related sense that it helps me see how they open up new lines of research, many of which are in fact already very much in play. In making the argument that populism studies should be seen as a vanishing mediator, I not only do so by standing on the shoulders of giants like Ernesto Laclau, but also by amplifying certain aspects of work that are co-written and co-inspired by many scholars, including colleagues of mine, in particular Benjamin de Kleen, Aurélien Modon, Yannis Stavrakakis, Savas Voutiras, and others actually who are here present in the room. I should also say that in referring to populism studies, I mean to include those studies for which the objects of analysis are populist discourses, as well as those studies whose objects of investigation are discourses about populism, if only because populism can be understood not only as a concept with a meaning, but also as a word, as a signifier that can be put to use. Given this particular qualification, what I want to say can be summarized as follows. I suggest that such populism studies, as understood through the Lacloian prism, can and perhaps should be understood as a vanishing mediator, in the sense that these studies should act as an enabler in our effort to draw out what really matters from a normative, ideological, and political point of view. This argument emerges in response to a perceived fatigue, impatience, and frustration, not to say a certain malaise, associated with some strands of populism studies which have become preoccupied with the question of whether a discourse, a party, or a movement is or is not populist, often losing sight of the point of such studies. It may be tempting in this scenario to abandon the concept of populism, and with it populism studies as a whole, for example, and to start tackling and to use concepts that are better suited to tackling what is really at stake. And here I'm thinking of concepts like class or race or authoritarianism or nationalism and so on. I want to caution against succumbing to this particular temptation, and this not only because populism can and perhaps should remain a viable strategic form of political engagement, but because I don't think such a solution takes seriously enough the virtues of Ernesto Laclau's approach to populism. One of the key virtues of Laclau's approach, and why it is so distinctive in relation to most other approaches, is, of course, that it's defined in formal terms that render content and context secondary, even the minimal content associated with so-called thin approaches. But it would be a mistake to claim that just because such content and context is secondary from a formal point of view, it is also unimportant. Given today's audience, I am not going to rehearse in detail Laclau's notion of populism, of course. Suffice to say that insisting on treating populism in formal terms is simply to insist that the categories of the people as underdog or the elite as illegitimate do not and should not be understood to have any natural meaning that could give us any real clue about what the demands being made by populists, nor any vision of a future imagined society. Instead, populist actors are understood to construct this by participating in a struggle with others in a particular context. The point I'm making here, and which others have made too, of course, is that underplaying the formal character of populism as a theoretical category, and thus the constructed nature of particular empirical populisms, risks reifying a substantive idea of populism. And the danger with such a substantive reification of populism is that it ends up covering over differences between populisms, which are absolutely central in any effort we make to understand and then respond to the so-called populist moment. In other words, tackling populism should be understood also as a question about tackling populisms in the plural, one by one. Laclau's formal approach to populism has many related virtues which many have noted, including Laclau himself. For example, it helps us avoid some frequently made conflations of populism with nationalism, or with the right, with demagoguery, with opportunism, with being a political outsider, or with authoritarianism, or with being anti-democratic or anti-pluralist, and so on. But the formal aspect of this approach is significant for another set of reasons. For example, placing the accent on the formal character of populism makes it possible to think the idea of a transnational populism that is not necessarily tied to the demands that are defined in National Geographic terms. It might also make thinkable the idea of a sub-national populism that is also not tied to demands that are defined in National Geographic terms, and that can therefore be understood to be internal to a party or an organization or a movement, for example, and so on. But these are not the virtues of the Laclauian approach I have in mind when I suggest we should regard populism studies as a vanishing mediator. Populism studies becomes a vanishing mediator when it succeeds in revealing to us that the relevant issues are not what or where we think they are, namely in populism as such, but elsewhere, thereby prompting a process of re-problematization. From this point of view, The problem is not so much populism as it is the normative, ideological, or political effects of particular populisms or associated conditions such as polarization or institutional distrust and so on and so forth. Conceiving populism studies as a vanishing mediator means that the aims of populism studies, now reconfigured more explicitly as critical populism studies, is to pull off a kind of vanishing act. So the key virtue of Ernesto Laclau's formal approach to populism is not only to help us avoid getting bogged down in endless debates about the contents of populism as contents of populism, but to help shift our focus onto the contents of populism as contents that matter, including the way we are invested in them, and to do so from a normative and ideological point of view. By normative here, I simply mean to refer broadly to the norms or ideals or principles or policies associated with one or another social, economic, or political program. From a normative point of view, understanding populism studies as a vanishing mediator translates into a kind of injunction to separate out the formal features of a populist phenomenon in order to focus on the content that matters. Concrete demands and their leaders may be popular, economically egalitarian, they may be neoliberal, authoritarian, or pluralist and democratic, they may be conservative, or they may be xenophobic, they may be racist or sexist, and so on. So in some populist discourses, what might be seen as problematic are their exclusionary nativist normative contents, or their regressive neoliberal contents, or in other contexts, populist discourses might be seen as praiseworthy because of their progressive economic content or their democratic normative content. From an ideological point of view, understanding populism studies as a vanishing mediator aims to shift our attention to the way we engage with the normative content that matters. Actually, shifting our attention to the ideological significance of populist phenomena also serves well as a kind of seg already into my remarks on critical fantasy studies. This is because when I invoke the term ideology, I do not invoke it merely in its ideational sense, in the way we refer to conservatism, liberalism, socialism, nationalism as ideologies. By ideology here, I aim to capture something not simply about those ideas or norms, but about the way we engage with them, the way we are invested in them emotionally or affectively, or to put it in psychoanalytic terms, the way we identify with them. So from an ideological point of view, rather than simply from a normative point of view, a populist movement, populist party, or populist discourse can be linked to different forms of affective investment, depending on how the subject mediates the content of that discourse with one or another fantasy. Fantasies of racial or ethnic purity, nostalgic fantasies of past glory, fantasies of mastery, self-sufficiency, fantasies of a caring other, and so on. Do we engage with this content in open ways that affirm their uncertain character and that acknowledge our anxieties and doubts? Or do we engage with them in ways that can be characterized as closed, rooted in resentment, hatred, fear, and the threat projected onto others? The point here is that in appreciating the complex ways we identify and affectively engage with the norms and the ideas that govern our everyday experience, and in appreciating how these affective engagements are structured by fantasies that underpin them, fantasies of individual mastery and control, for instance, we can gain some insight into the question of why and how certain populist discourses can exercise their grip and might therefore seem hard to budge. And what is said here about populist discourses from an ideological point of view can also be said with respect to discourses about populism. And here it's worth noting how performances of discourses about populism can be ones in which we condemn populist discourses and movements. This would be a case of anti-populist discourses about populism. Or these performances can be ones in which we celebrate populist discourses and movements. This would be a case of pro-populist discourses about populism. Take, for example, the case of anti-populist discourses. Many, for example, have noted the palpable enjoyment of late-night TV programs that pour scorn on Trump and Trump supporters, Brexit and Brexit supporters, inviting a wide range of citizens to identify with the figure of the reasonable and the enlightened and the liberal or the educated, often against the figure of the unreasonable, the irrational, the illiberal, the illiterate, the emotional, the naive, and so on. It is very interesting, therefore, to ask ourselves, what are the affects, what are the phantasmatic narratives that accompany the positions anti-pluralists are invited to identify with, rather than focus only or predominantly, let's say, on the subject positions with which populists are invited to identify with. From this point of view, not sufficient attention has been devoted to the politics and ideology of anti-populist rhetoric itself, particularly its role in sustaining the appeal of reactionary populist right-wing movements and in sustaining normatively problematic understandings of democracy and race relations. Perhaps charged words and images that point to underlying fantasies that structure some forms of affective investment should attract greater analytical and critical attention, if only to acknowledge why it is often so challenging to engage political adversaries by appealing primarily to facts and figures. I'm already moving into another territory, one which I'm here calling critical fantasy studies. And that's because these days it's a cliche to say that pointing wide-eyed with urgency to the facts of the matter only goes so far in the game of persuasion. This has become a cliche, which is a point brought into sharp relief in a context in which we regularly affirm the existence of alternative facts, or when we casually hurl the term fake news at people whose views we don't share, or when we acknowledge that we are living in an era of post-truths. So I've entitled my second set of remarks Critical Fantasy Studies because I think it sort of carves out a bit of a space here within which to explore the question of facts of the matter, including, in particular, what appeals to the facts of the matter in our games of persuasion. From a psychoanalytic point of view, that which escapes facts of the matter, as well as allied expressions like rational self-interest, has many names. Fantasy is obviously one of those names, but there are others. For example, desire, drive, jouissance or enjoyment, and so on. Everyday understandings of fantasy, of course, tend to oppose it to reality and the facts of the matter. However, one of the most intriguing insights that psychoanalysis brings for us and brings to bear on debates about ideology is the idea that fantasy is precisely not opposed to reality or the so-called facts of the matter, at least not necessarily so. What is important from the point of view of fantasy is that it is aligned with desire, not that it opposes some notion of representational truth. Ideology and representational truth certainly intersect, but they do so in ways that vectors intersect on a plane. They intersect while also often pointing in different directions. This psychoanalytic insight with respect to ideology can be brought out neatly by juxtaposing two claims. First, a statement may be no more ideological for being false. And second, a statement may be no less ideological for being true. And I'm going to try and unpack that. One way to do this is to point out how the false character of a claim is not in itself sufficient to elevate it to the level of desire or enjoyment. It's not sufficient to elevate it to the level of ideology. In other words, just because a statement is false, this does not mean it is also ideological. For example, a chief executive officer may falsely insist that his company's financial accounts have not been massaged to boost its shareholder value, as Skilling and Lay did in the heydays of Enron. But a lot more work would be required to show that these claims, these false claims and accompanying deceitful practices, are also caught up in circuits of desire and enjoyment. But we can go a step further. Not only is the falsity of a claim not sufficient to transform a statement into a statement about enjoyment and thus ideology, it is also not necessary. In fact, a statement may be no less ideological for being true. Or to put it in less tortuous terms, a statement may be thoroughly ideological while at the same time being true in the sense of representing reality faithfully. This, for me, in any case, is the takeaway insight that underpins Lacan's claim that just because his or her partner is found to be having an affair as a matter of fact does not mean that a person's jealousy cannot still be treated as pathological. What makes something appear invested with enjoyment, and in this sense ideological, is not linked to the issue of whether it corresponds or not to a consensus reality, so much as how it is caught up in a phantasmatic narrative governed by a logic of desire. And although I claim these to be psychoanalytic insights and observations, they are also they are only so because they have served as the focus of scholars who have explicitly set these up as a field worthy of systematic study from Freud onwards. But these observations and insights are not foreign to anyone who is a keen observer of human behavior, as is evident in the domains of philosophy and rhetoric and literature, to which one can add cinema and TV series and a whole host of other cultural productions. For me, the term fantasy in the title Critical Fantasy Studies signals that what is at stake in such studies is a more systematic attempt to foreground and explore what exactly psychoanalytic thought brings to bear on issues connected to claims about reality, rationality, and other facts of the matter. Here, fantasy and associated psychoanalytic concepts and insights simply serve a potentially interesting entry point for such studies. But the qualification of critical in critical fantasy studies is meant to capture something about how such studies, through their appeal to post-Marxism and post-structuralist discourse theory generally, and the logics approach specifically, seek to draw out the normative, ideological, and political implications of specific psychoanalytic insights and observations, and thus become part of a broader enterprise in critical, empirical, and theoretical research. One could say that a key condition for such a formulation of critical studies resides in the logics approach, at least the way we've tried to develop it, since the logic of fantasy was explicitly added as a separate, relatively individuated logic to sit alongside the social and political logics we've become familiar with through the work of Laclau and Mouffe. However, despite these qualifications, it's arguable that the notion of critical fantasy studies remains rather vague and perhaps very expansive. So perhaps it's worth mentioning here one classical problem domain which opens up a rich area for comparative analysis that readily feeds into the field of critical fantasy studies, and which concerns the widely noted problem of voting against one's interests, or more broadly, acting against one's own interests. In his book, Capitalism and Christianity, American Style, Bill Connolly refers to an incident in 2005 in which a group of parents and community citizens in Dover, Pennsylvania, succeeded in their political and legal campaign against a local school's board decision to introduce intelligent design into the classroom. In response to this action, the evangelical leader, Pat Robertson, addressed the community in the following way. I'd like to say to the good citizens of Dover, if there is a disaster in your area, don't turn to God. You just rejected him from your city. And don't wonder why he hasn't helped you when problems begin, if they begin. I'm not saying that they will, but if they do, just remember, you just voted God out of your city. And if that's the case, don't ask for his help because he might not be there. Perhaps we could say that in rejecting intelligent design, Pat Robertson here implies that the good citizens of Dover are clearly acting against their own interests. From this point of view, Robertson's outburst might open up a more general set of questions about how particular affective investments can lead us to act contrary to our interests, as well as how to discern what those interests are. Many today, for example, are perplexed by those who voted for Trump or Brexit. In railing against and venting hatred towards government and elite institutions, it's often thought that such voters, often described as working class voters, have succeeded in voting against their own interests. But what is often left out of such analyses are the dynamics of enjoyment that are at play. Whether or not we also end up characterizing such dynamics as having a vector that points towards our real interests or away from them, or at some other angle towards them. An interesting starting point, in fact, in unpacking such dynamics of enjoyment is the psychoanalytic insight that what binds a community together is often not simply an identification with a common ideal like justice or freedom, but also an identification with a common form of transgression. And in particular, the enjoyment that's derived from this transgression, an enjoyment often supported with reference to a readily available alibi. Consider, for example, the great thrill experienced at witnessing politically correct liberals being flummoxed. I can refer here to another Connolly astute observation, this time about the role of SUVs, that the role of the SUV played in George W. Bush's 2004 presidential campaign. The SUV served literally and metaphorically as a vehicle that carried a message designed to poke fun at the politically correct establishment and also to capture something about the process of enjoyment and transgression. After Bush's entourage sped around a NASCAR track attended by tens of thousands of fans, and I'm quoting, Bush emerged from the only SUV in the entourage to an incredible roar of approval. The crowd responded to this SUV as a symbol of disdain for ecologists, safety advocates, supporters of fuel economy, worrywarts about global warming, weak-willed pluralists, and supporters of international accords like the Kyoto Treaty. Bush played upon the symbol and drew energy from the crowd's acclamation of it. But, and this is the moment of the alibi, his handlers could say, when asked, that he just happened to ride in that vehicle, sending a surge of joy through followers who both love the message and the way it flummoxes its critical commentators. Related to this is the sort of enjoyment associated with what I could call barefaced mega-lies. It's a particularly dramatic species of false news, or alternative facts and conspiracy theories in this post-truth era. And obviously one of the most emblematic of these examples is Trump's claims about attendance figures at the inaugural speech. Of course, one can add to that flat earther claims about the moon landing being a hoax, and various other general claims of the conspiracy theory sort. But what these claims do, ultimately, is bamboozle a liberal elite wedded to the sanctity of objective facts and figures and rationality. And in doing so, it demonstrates that what is really at stake is the construction and sustenance of a collective identity through that process of transgression. What brings people together is a collective enjoyment that takes aim at liberal elites being bamboozled and at a loss about how on earth to respond, since these claims defy the senses and established common sense in such a spectacular way. What is interesting here is that we appear to have less a transgression of particular boundaries than an attack on the conditions of possibility of setting up such boundaries in the first place. Or if we insist on calling it transgression, it appears to be of a rather fundamental or primary sort of transgression. It's not so much about transgressing a boundary as it is about attacking the boundary itself And this is truly horrifying because it literally takes the feet away from us. This is because it is an attack on the very rules that make possible the production of credible statements, whether these are cashed out in moral terms, as in the case of PC wars, or in epistemological terms regarding knowledge claims about climate change, for example. So a critical fantasy studies approach might very well train our attention on the tenor of hatred directed at big government and particularly elite institutions, not to mention a wide range of scapegoats, showing how this hatred is not simply an emotion born of legitimate anger and resentment, but that there is something excessive in the way this hatred is expressed and lived. We might then read this hatred as an affective investment that is enjoyed in this particular psychoanalytic sense. And in these cases, the affective investment always appears excessive because there is something else at stake, something else at stake, these attempts at all costs to avoid a more troubling confrontation. But this is just the beginning and precisely the point where things start to get messy, because the enjoyment dimension here should be understood to sit alongside other dimensions of social and political life. The danger is that a purely psychoanalytic characterization may lead some to exaggerate the role of affect. Oh, I should be stopping soon. The danger is that a purely psychoanalytic characterization may lead some to exaggerate the role of affect and unconscious enjoyment in accounting for both the fascination and the inertia of such phenomena. It may suggest that the explanation of the Trump, anti-Trump, Brexit or anti-Brexit phenomena can be entirely or predominantly understood in terms of the culturally inflected fantasies that make such unconscious enjoyment possible. In other words, we need to guard against a kind of psychoanalytic imperialism, akin to the kind of economic imperialism we are more familiar with, and to regard it much more as an entry point. And so my point here really is that a fantasy-based account comprises one sort of hypothesis, let us say, one sort of hypothesis that can be set alongside a set or a host of other hypotheses. Critical fantasy studies, in this view, could perhaps should also engage in these wider comparative studies that would bring into play other non-psychoanalytic hypotheses. Why? In part, to better characterize the psychoanalytic insight that is at stake here. Why? In part, to ascertain better how it relates to other hypothetical elements in our overall explanatory account. Why? In part, to discern when and how factors rooted in unconscious enjoyment and fantasy may play a more or less prominent role, depending on the context, but also, in part, and crucially so, to draw out the relevant normative, ideological, and political implications. My argument here is that this comparative and interdisciplinary aspect of critical fantasy studies is crucial in establishing a range of research projects that transform it into an exciting, I think, research project that brings the logic of the unconscious into contact with other logics and mechanisms. So in conclusion, if I had to summarize what follows from these latter observations related to critical fantasy studies, these more cautionary remarks, let's say, cautionary to try and guard against a temptation toward kind of a psychoanalytic imperialism, and I would try to summarize that through the following expression, which some of you are already familiar with. Not all that is not conscious is unconscious. This expression, not all that is not conscious is unconscious, simply captures the idea that not all that is not subject to our conscious cognitive apprehension and rational control can or should necessarily be understood with reference to the Freudian unconscious. Affirming this idea, however, also implies affirming the challenge to tackle the rather tricky questions of how to incorporate non-conscious as well as non-unconscious factors into our account, what relative weights to attribute to them, how to articulate them, and so on. If not all that is not subject to conscious individual or collective control is reducible to unconscious processes, a critical fantasy studies approach must be ready to engage with and combine often prima facie heterogeneous factors, often the focus of distinct disciplines, including coercion, various institutional constraints and logics, whether political or economic, competing normative values, causal mechanisms, phantasmatic enjoyment, and so on. And with that, I conclude.
Thanks. Shall I just use that?
Do you want to use the other one?
Oh, no,
It's
this
up
is
to you.
okay. This is fine. Yeah. Well, no, it's too much fuss. We haven't got much time, have we? So I'll just press on. If you don't mind me holding this lollipop. Can you hear me? No? Okay. They can't hear me. Sorry. Okay. Is that better? Can you hear me? No, still not. Aha. Can you hear me now? Is that good? Yeah, okay. Well, I mean, if you had a tough act to follow, we've got an even tougher act to follow. And I'm not even going to try and engage with the high theory. And for the benefit of those who are watching the live streaming, there are about 4,000 people here at this inaugural event. I want to say something, and well, thank you so much for inviting me, and the usual kind of thanks for the wonderful organisation of this event. It really has been great. And I'm particularly pleased to be invited. As Jenny and I have often remarked, we're very much on the kind of periphery of the Essex School. We've never been through the programme. We're very honoured to be invited. And I think it's kind of testament to David and Jason, the extent to which they're prepared to kind of reach out to extend their network, to enrol people in the network. So I want to say something about how I personally came to the logics of critical explanation, where that took me and how I've applied it, in inverted commas. I want to say something about David and Jason as people, because I think that's relevant to the history of the development of the logics and to the development of post-Marxist critical inquiry more generally, and we often overlook that. And finally, if there's time, which I doubt there is, I want to say something about the conditions for continuing this kind of work of interpretive critical explanation. So David and Jason's book, I mean, we don't need to really rehearse this, do we? The Logics of Critical Explanation in Social and Political Theory entered the scene at a timely point in the development of critical political analysis. It was an important reminder, I think, that as critical scholars, we're all more or less in the same ballpark, and that what matters is that we find ways to stand up to our common enemies, if I can put it that way, the positivists and the pure interpretivists. So while it's true to say that Laclau and Mouffe's establishment of the Ideology and Discourse programme had already spawned a healthy enterprise in critical analysis centred on post-structuralist, post-Marxist discourse theory, Jason and David's work was certainly a fillip to that enterprise, particularly in developing the theorisation of the affective dimension of discursive formations and in marking out a clearer distinction between genealogical deconstruction and onto-ethical critique. I think 2 or even possibly 3 or even 4 generations of PhDs have followed in their wake. And as Moya Lloyd observed yesterday, spanning a whole range of fields of political and social science interest, and it was really heartening actually to hear her say that actually the Department of Government at Essex is most well known for post-structuralist discourse theory. So I think that was a nice testament, really. So I first came to David and Jason's work and to post-Marxism more generally via Steve Griggs, who's not here. So he's the one who's responsible. And he owes me money, but never mind, we won't go there. I put in a paper proposal for a panel on the logics at an interpretive policy analysis conference in Grenoble. I can't remember when it was exactly, 2009, 2010, something like that. And my paper was about what might be gained from articulating material relationality, actor network theory, ontological politics, vital materialism, etc., with post-structuralist discourse theory within the logics framework. That was my theoretical bag at the time. Jason and David, I don't think were at all persuaded, but they were incredibly patient and gracious. But this articulation seems to strike a chord in certain quarters, curiously in Sweden and Australia in the main, and I'm looking at Mick over there. I had several invitations to speak on this articulation, and several of them actually with Jason. I still think there's something to be said about this articulation between new materialism, vital materialism, etc., And it doesn't need any help, actually, from me. It seems to have cornered the market in many branches of the social sciences, notably geography, political economy, feminist studies, critical pedagogy, etc. Not surprisingly, perhaps, given its orientation to the crafting of more hopeful narratives and practices. But I've moved on, firmly under the influence of post-structuralist discourse theory and critical fantasy studies. I think I've actually moved on. Clearly, I prefer something a little more sour, although I haven't entirely shaken off my materialist sensibility. So just to say something about what I've done since I first encountered David and Jason and the logics approach and post-Marxism, I've drawn on the logics framework, more or less faithfully, in my own work, and in work that I've actually co-authored with Jason to think about the ways in which policy, broadly understood as technologies and programs of governing, directed at older people and the ageing society, constructs and outright ignores the older person, and to think about how age, ageing and death are thematized in policy and cultural narratives. I should have explained that actually my field is critical gerontology. So just in case you hadn't realised that. You can't really get more real-worldly or applied than this, I don't think. So, for example, in my work on adult social care reform and the turn towards the personalisation of adult social services, I was interested in how older people seem to be left on the periphery of this discursive formation. Although the over 65s are the largest group of users of adult care services and whose condition in terms of care is worsening dramatically. So to cut a long story short, I argued that reformers, both academics and practitioners, being over-invested in fantasies of plausible perfectibility like personalisation and person-centeredness and other humanist tropes, were unintentionally complicit in holding older adults in a state of semi-permanent limbo as the unexceptional exception in this particular field of discursivity. It wasn't exactly critical fantasy studies, but it was something in that vein. I've also worked with Jason and separately on thinking about how fantasy and enjoyment circulates in assisted living environments and communities, where third agers and frail older people code well. One piece of work actually gave rise to a policy recommendation for bereavement support and has now been implemented, in other words, become a social logic, although not without some troubling phantasmatic investment in this new hegemonic scenario of plausible perfectibility. And so that is now becoming my next critical project. So you see how it works here. You develop a critical explanation, you make some recommendation, it becomes a social logic that's phantasmatically invested, and then you get your next gig, which is to research that process. I'm also thinking about how we're responding to demographic change within the current conjuncture, how demographic change coincides and intersects with political, economic, and ecological turmoil, Why is it that we prefer to stoke up intergenerational hatred than to mobilise against the general degradation of life course opportunities and the cancellation of retirement and the economic and subjective freedom that offered? Why is it that we prefer to hold a generational cohort responsible for ecological collapse and rampant house price inflation rather than the hegemonic order that made it so? How can we think about the subjectivity of older workers and consumers in an era of radical uncertainty and commanded enjoyment? I'm thinking with critical fantasy studies, but also with other Lacanian theorists who are making the link between libidinal and the political economy. And I really, just to give a shout out here, I really liked Jake Flavel's excellent panel on this kind of theme yesterday. So my approach and theorisation of all these projects flows from my first encounter with David and Jason, the logics and post-Marxism. So I want to say something about David and Jason as people. I think we all know that they've ensured that post-Marxism is alive and well and thriving, but I think we can overlook the fact that aside from the fact that the project is intellectually stimulating and coherent, it's also partly down to them as people, at the way that it's carried across this large network. And I was struck actually when I was walking around the campus that you have this strap line, which was just perfect for the occasion, alongside a big poster of John Burko, who's the new poster boy. Fantastic. And the slogan is brave enough to have new ideas, generous enough to share them. And that just struck me as perfect. So I hope you don't mind me appropriating that marketing gimmick of the neoliberal university to describe you, but I think it's a perfect epithet. So they've given very generously of their time to several generations of PhD students, as we've already mentioned, both here at Essex and around the world. I mean, this is a global brand, make no mistake. They make time for people. I think that's what is so excellent. They don't judge. They never make you feel stupid. You might feel stupid, but it's not because they've made you feel stupid. For high theoreticians, I think this is really quite something, actually. In many ways, then, I would say that David and Jason are the bearers of the very ontology that they espouse. They refuse to speak from the position of the master or the discourse of the university. They work in a spirit of generosity and agonistic respect. And if I've got time, I just wanted to share two little anecdotes with you that would illustrate that. I remember another conference that we were at, and I'm not going to go into the details or the personalities, but I remember that there was an ad hominem attack against the logics approach on the part of a rival theoretician who will be nameless. And the rest of us who were there, in the gang, were standing there, with righteous indignation, ready to go for it. These two, nothing of the sort. They went out and sought out this guy in the coffee break and sat down and had a nice, agonistically respectful conversation with him. I mean, it was an eye-opener, and it actually taught me something, quite important about how to do this kind of critical work, which I think is an element that is this often overlooked. Another time, I was at an event with Jason. I think we were both doing a sort of keynote speech or something, and I came over all, insecure about the whole thing. And, I was struggling and saying, I can't make any sense of this. I don't know what this is all about. What shall I do? And he said, I don't know, Karen, I feel exactly the same. And I thought, no, you're the one who's supposed to know. This isn't how it's meant to be. But anyway, so that was, I think, that summarises, I think those two little anecdotes for me summarise David and Jason as onto-ethical subjects, if I can put it that way. How am I doing for time? Have I got a couple more minutes?
Yeah, you have 4 more minutes.
4 more minutes, okay. So I just wanted to think about the conditions for the future then of this enterprise. I mean, I think we all worry that the space for critical inquiry is narrowing in the increasingly neoliberally inclined university. And this can be done by fear, closing down departments, making it difficult to make certain appointments. But it's also the case that certain kinds of critical approaches can be squeezed out in more subtle ways. Interpretive critical analysis of the post-Marxist logics kind is not an easy undertaking, and we've just heard that from the way that David and Jason have been talking about it. I think it's an art and a craft that takes time to learn and practice. I don't think it's ever a case of simply applying the method. And I can't speak for other countries, but in the UK, PhD students are squeezed through a three-year sausage machine in a system that is obsessed with methods in a very narrow sense of the term. Data and real-world solutions. We all have to generate impact now, which is not a bad thing in itself, but it's become something of a fetish. In such a system, students seek tried and tested boilerplated approaches, I think. They do critical discourse analysis, or they do frame analysis, or they do Q method. I don't think there's any doing the logics approach, nor do I think we should ever seek to get to a situation where that is the case. Personally speaking, I think the approach can be really productive, but I think it's fair to say that the kind of critical analyses that I've produced are not exactly my day job. They come as a byproduct of perhaps more boilerplated research proposals, and I've done this kind of work in the interstices. Essex seems to be a particularly nurturing environment for this kind of work, but I fear that minds generally are not open to this kind of work elsewhere, at least not in the UK, but I could be wrong about that. But so as not to end on this bleak note, I'd like to join the organisers in celebrating the current health of post-Marxism in its logics incarnation. And I'd like to celebrate this dynamic duo for being brave enough to have new ideas and generous enough to share them with us.
Yes, I think so. And then I need to put it on.
Just need it. There we go.
And
Yeah.
oh yeah. Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah. People are nodding. Good. Sure. In the back too. Yeah. Good. Yes, I will begin, of course, by thanking, of course, Jason and David, and of course, Jemina and Kostis for the invitation, and to thank everyone who has contributed to make this conference happen and to make it such a great event, including everyone who has presented and discussed their work and ideas. It's been very special for me to be back here in Essex and to once again be reminded of what a vibrant community of scholars and students we are. And I'm appealing to a we here because I think that this we is so important. And it is important to be reminded of how the IDA program has been a place and an intellectual environment in this which we or us has been formed and which over the years has thrived and become a global community that it is now. So I'll read my short presentation in order to keep the limited time, and I'll start with some more general issues that I hope will tie back to David and Jason's work, but also issues of populism and fantasy, among other things. So as we heard yesterday, Chantal Mouffe has argued that Europe today finds itself in a populist moment, the outcome of which will be decisive for the future of European democracies. And, I would add, which is becoming increasingly obvious for the future of democracy on a larger transnational scale. As a result of a neoliberal hegemony that has led to increasing inequalities and a shift of power from democratic to financial actors, an increasing number of political movements and parties who claim to give voice back to the people have emerged. In some countries, such as Poland and Hungary, these political actors have successfully made it into power and begun a devastating process to dismantle the fundamental ideals and institutions on which modern liberal democracy, if only in the form of unrealized promises, rests. Equality on the one hand and popular sovereignty on the other. As we have seen throughout Europe, many of the voices that claim to give the power back to the people come from right-wing populist movements and parties. They promise, in MOVE's words, that they will bring back national sovereignty and restore democracy. But we know that when they speak of sovereignty, they articulate this as a national sovereignty that is reserved only for those that are considered true nationals. As we know, thereby, they certainly do not respond to the democratic demand for equality, but articulate the people in highly exclusionary ways and formulate a number of groups, immigrants, Jews, cultural Marxists, and feminists, as threats to the nation. Although MOVE adds the caveat that her recent analysis of the present conjuncture shall be limited to Western European contexts, her perspective also speaks to the development towards so-called illiberal democracy in Central and Eastern Europe, and despite very different regional histories, also far beyond. The failures of previous political hegemonies, such as the European belief in neoliberal markets and liberal democracy, have left the playing field open to movements and leaders who seem to be becoming increasingly authoritarian, but who keep claiming to speak in the name of the people and ordinary and normal people against a liberal global elite that is said to force its liberal and globalist worldview and lifestyle on others through totalitarian measures. As part of this development, conservative anti-feminist and anti-LGBTQ sentiments have entered politics on both sides of the Atlantic with a renewed form and force, and made a strong alliance with illiberal or authoritarian regimes and right-wing populist movements, articulating gender as a key element of their construction of an alien threat to the nation, and making abortion and normative heterosexuality into key symbolic issues in their politics of traditional values. In doing so, they have successfully managed to gain wide support for what Polish scholars Elżbieta Korolczuk and Agnieszka Graf have called a new universalism that, in their words, replaces individual rights with rights of the family as a basic societal unit and depicts religious conservatives as an embattled minority, end of quote. And thereby they have built successful national and transnational alliances between conservative religious actors, including conservative Catholics, Orthodox groups, and evangelicals, with authoritarian-minded populists, and an increasing number of countries. This has started to create these alliances between secular conservative or authoritarian and extreme right-wing movements and political parties as well. So in this process, gender has become a kind of negative empty signifier that stands not only for gender equality and sexual diversity, but has come to symbolize an enemy picture that they say threaten everything from free speech through legislation against hate speech, the health of children who have to endure sexual education in schools, women who are deprived of their femininity and role as mothers, the freedom of citizens to choose for themselves how to lead their lives as normal men and women, and indeed Christian or Western, depending on who speaks, civilization as such. This mobilization is supported by an admittedly twisted but internally coherent narrative of gender ideology, which has proven extremely successful in creating alliances between groups who would previously not necessarily see themselves as part of the same struggle, by the creation of precisely the type of chains of equivalences that Chantal Mouffe spoke about yesterday. In other words, gender has come to play an increasingly central role for drawing political frontiers, and this, I believe, constitutes a major challenge for us as a research community on several levels that we need to collectively address. So first, although Laclau and Mouffe's theorization of hegemony and populism has been hugely productive, indeed imperative, in understanding the current geopolitical developments in Europe and globally, there are few scholars that work within their tradition that have thoroughly investigated the role that issues of gender, reproduction, and sexuality has played historically in populist movements, as well as their significance for current mobilizations. I argue that it's high time for us to further address these issues, both empirically and theoretically, and, as I will discuss later, that the currently successful mobilization against critical theory more generally, and feminist scholarship in particular, has broader implications for us as a research community and for our very conditions to conduct critical research. Empirically, we need to further investigate how and why opposition to gender ideology has become such a very effective strategy to unite a broad range of reactionary actors, from populist nationalist movements and parties and these Christian groups, as well as neo-Nazi groups, for example. So which are the powerful fantasies of gender that support this development, and why have they proven to have had such a strong effective grip? What are the practices that sustains this enjoyment? How do effects such as fear, disgust, and rage operate in this mobilization? What role does aspects of sex, gender, and reproduction play in different articulations of the people? Which are the narratives about how the people, quite literally, is reproduced, and how these narratives are implemented in political demands and policies? Who is forced to give birth against their will for the people, and conversely, who is deemed unfit for reproducing the people, denied the right to reproduce by way of coerced medical interventions or discriminatory laws? So how is the narrative of gender ideology played out in the articulation, in the overlapping enemy picture of political correctness and anti-communism, as well as right-wing populist articulations of freedom and appeals to biological science, which is then posed as opposed to the ideology of gender? But also more generally, how do fantasies of gender, sexuality, and reproduction support different social and political logics in different historical and cultural contexts? And how have previous gendered regimes opened up the space for the current reactions? Theoretically, we need to at least consider whether there is something about sex, gender, and reproduction that deserves further scrutiny in order to help us to think the gendered polarization that has erupted in this populist moment. By this statement, I'm neither proposing that we should go back to old-school essentialism, nor that we should let what Diana Fuss once called an essentialist paranoia prevent us from investigating these issues more closely. But rather, I think that it's imperative that we keep exploring and expanding the psychoanalytic strand of political discourse theory that has already proven to be so productive. In addition to the importance that we already know of about a Freudian understanding of collective mobilization, the massive work on subjectivity and identification, and Jason's and other scholars' work on fantasy, I think that when it comes to investigating these issues of sex, gender, and reproduction, we might want to look at the work of psychoanalytic feminist scholarship, like, for example, just to mention a couple, that of Jacqueline Rose and Alenka Šupancic, because I think they have something important to contribute. In her recent book, What is Sex, for example, Šupancic convincingly argues for the importance of thinking emancipatory politics through the concept of the non-relation, and reminds us that what has been emancipatory about feminism is that it has indeed insisted that there is a divide, a non-relation, and precisely thereby articulating the patriarchal order as unjust. And that conversely, the most oppressive societies are those who strive for the relation with a big R, that is, a harmonious universe in which women and men live accordingly to so-called traditional values. She's also made a very enlightening analogy actually here with the workers' struggle. And she has discussed issues about how capitalism exploits the non-relation in its own very specific way. But I don't have time to go into that now. But I think this is something that we could further explore in the future. Second, these challenges overlap in part with strategic and political challenges that concern the place of post-structuralist and feminist theorizing, as well as post-Marxist critique in universities more broadly. In the context of the new political landscape, attacks on our legitimacy and existence have taken a different form, one that needs to be responded to differently than the previous positivist criticisms and neoliberal university management that we have become so used to defending ourselves against. While the latter, by all means, is still alive and kicking, the new polarized geopolitical situation means that our very kind of scholarship is increasingly pointed out as ideologically, politically correct, or simply political and non-scientific. And while feminist and gender studies are not the only ones threatened, in many places they have been the first and perhaps easiest targets. Indeed, such hatred to our kind of scholarship has closed down educational programs and even incited violent attacks against thinkers such as Judith Butler in Brazil, remember? And more recently at Kimberly Crenshaw, the founder of the theory of intersectionality in London earlier this spring. And a bomb replica was placed outside the Secretariat for Gender Research in Gothenburg not long ago. We have also seen the purge of critical scholarship, not least feminist, but not exclusively so, from, for example, Turkish University. And only a few days ago, I was notified that an excellent colleague of ours, philosopher Luciana Cadahia, was dismissed from her post in Colombia. Each and every attack on these critical scholars and the numerous others that I cannot name is an assault on our very community and calls for solidarity. But importantly, we need to acknowledge that this development is not a matter of ignorance on behalf of the attackers or of simple anti-intellectualism or even merely as a threat to academic freedom, a term that I think is a bit of a double-edged sword, as it, rather like the idea of free speech, is easily mobilized for radically different purposes. Because, simultaneously, these self-appointed defenders of science and warriors against ideology are engaging in their own knowledge production, starting their own courses, holding their own conferences, and producing new books. In Sweden, for example, an extremely conservative think tank called the Clapham Institute recently launched their own privately funded Biblical Research Council with well-established researchers as its esteemed board members. A development I, for one, certainly did not see coming in one of the most secularized countries in the world. The tactics they use in this ongoing sort of culture war, which is part of this knowledge production, are inspired by, among others, guess who? Gramsci. So I would like to just throw this out here in this group of scholars, because when reading their text, it's very much like reading a work of like ideology critique sometimes. They're more or less blunt about it, but they basically use our own thoughts and theoretical tools or weapons against us. So, yeah, so that was my end. Yeah. Yes, so, oh, you have one.
Ooh. Okay. Well, I won't detain you too long. Let me just start by, again, thanking everybody for making this possible. I must say I found it exceptionally stimulating and enlightening, so I'm really so grateful for this event being put on. So I work in a business school. My area of research is in management and organisation theory and that kind of thing. And so again, I'm sort of an outsider, but I have found the approach being developed here exceptionally helpful and challenging in examining the practices of organising and the practices of management. And I think if we think about organisation and management, not so much as perhaps, oh, well, that's kind of business, but if we think about them as social practices, then I think maybe the relevance of this approach that we've been exploring over the last couple of days becomes more obvious and perhaps less alien in terms of the connection with the area of business and management. On that point, I mean, one thing that could, I think, be helpful in terms of developing and projecting this approach would be the issue of branding, because it does go under a number of possible signifiers, and I think to sort of try and bring them together under one recognisable signifier would be would be quite helpful. But that was just a slight aside. In the context of management and organisation and the kinds of work that's done in that field, where there's a resonance is with various turns that have occurred in that field, turns towards language, towards practice, and more recently towards affect. And so there is potentially a strong resonance with the kind of ideas that we've been exploring here, and arguably a framework that I think, because of its distinctiveness, which I think is, for me, around the ontology of lack, which we don't find in, let's say, other maybe comparable approaches drawn from Bourdieu or Giddens or wherever it may be within my field. That offers something very helpful and distinctive, because it then draws us into explorations of dislocation, antagonism, and so forth. So that's the connection, I think, that can be made with the field in which I work. Now, the real challenge then is not to bastardize this framework, and that's the real risk. That we engage it, but in a sort of half-witted approach, or alternatively we just kind of clone it. So the challenge, I think, is really to see if there's any way in which we can contribute to it, and I think there's two ways possibly that can be done. First of all, through conducting empirical studies. Either based on primary material, secondary material, or reinterpretation of existing studies. So I think that's something that is going on, and there's quite a developing body of literature now in my field that is engaging with this approach. But maybe we can also raise some questions about the approach, and I'm just going to conclude by signalling something that might be worth further exploration. So, something David touched on, which is the question of what this approach, what values this approach is grounded in. And if the answer to that, there may be several answers, but I'm just going to take up the radical democracy answer to that question. So if we say that the inspiration or the values that underpin this approach are those of radical democracy, then we have to ask the question, well, what is that? What are those values? And I think to some extent Jason answered that question when he was emphasizing the importance of openness. And I think along with that value of openness is the value of generosity and agonistic respect. So if those indeed are the values, and you just follow me along this path for a minute, how do we bring together, if not reconcile, those values with what I think I heard David saying in terms of privileging the project of developing causal explanations? Is this the main way, the only way, the best way of articulating in the context of a scholarly community the values that I'm suggesting underpin this framework, and more specifically pointing to the values of radical democracy? Or, to come to Jason's presentation, that's my final point, maybe does raising this question, in other words, I'm questioning the way in which engagement with the problematic of causality is prioritized. I'm suggesting that. We can challenge that, obviously, but does raising questions about that, is that actually an instance of what Jason was talking about when he talked about bamboozling through transgression. So I was kind of trying to raise the question here about what is consistent with the underpinning values of this approach, and to what extent is the concern with causal explanation consistent with those values? That's the kind of question that I would like to just raise. And I'd just like to thank everybody again for making this possible, and thank you also for staying on so late and just listening to what we have to say. And I hope there's the time now just to open things up.
So we have 20 minutes for a round of Q&A. Just raise your hand on the
Hi, thank you for bringing. Okay.
Can people not hear at the back? We can.
Okay.
I think you're okay.
This works. Okay. Thank you for the very interesting closing remarks. I think maybe a takeaway I had from sort of all of your speeches is that a day to formulate MSB, radical rights, movements that are coming up are using sort of these our logics as well as you pointed to. And then I'm kind of wondering, how can we escape that? As you just pointed to that they bamboozle us by transgressing the lines, and aren't we then stuck in a kind of polarization that you see with, for example, populism, anti-populism, that they're both kind of using the same tactics and talking next to each other. So how can we escape that, go beyond that, and maybe go back to agonistic, antagonistic politics? Is that still possible, and which tactics can be used from an activist point of view?
Are we going to take a couple?
Yeah.
This is, hi, hello everyone. Thank you very much, it's been wonderful. I'm glad I made the trip down here because I don't get a lot of this type of discussion at Oxford, sadly enough. That's a different story, so maybe you guys should branch out. Anyway, I have, maybe it's a naive question, but is radical democracy a means or an end? And I ask that because, of course, if it's, depending on if it's a means or an end or both, there's a different kind of normative assessment and judgment. And I'll just recapitulate my question to Chantal Mouffe, is that if it's a means, how successful has that means been in the last 35 years vis-a-vis the neoliberal, whatever you want to call it? And not, to be fair, not in terms of the world, but in terms of your own university or the university systems in the UK, because if we have trouble maintaining our territory or extending our territory in the university, what hope do we have for radical democracy beyond that? And I guess just as maybe a silly question, I'm wondering what the fantasy logics of Xyda are. So in terms of the phantasmic logic that kind of holds you guys together, have you turned your approach to the center itself, and what kind of things have you found there? Thank you.
Oh, yes. Great. Yeah, thank you very much for this panel. I have a question for Jason in particular, but I think for the entire panel. And I was really fascinated by this idea of fantasy studies. I was just wondering, what role do narratives and stories play in this moment of populism that we're seeing? Is it that liberalism and liberal hegemony has literally run out of plot and run out of story, and populism actually gives us heroes and villains, right? The tyrannical EU, making America great again, and sort of there is having a story in populism versus liberalism doesn't have them anymore. Thanks.
We'll start with those three.
First question. The notion of polarization and the use of tools. My view is that it's impossible to escape that. I mean, it's about hegemonies and counter-hegemonies. You've got attempts to try and construct narratives. It's not something that we're just become aware of. And it's about, and I think this connects to the last question about the construction of narratives from the point of view of the right, let's say, and from the point of view of the left, from the point of view of populism, from the point of view of anti-populism. My feeling is that what's at stake here is building up credible stories. And the question is, well, where do we look for? What do we look for? What sources are available to us in constructing these alternative stories? I'm not too sure if we can think about, certainly constructing a vision. Jody was talking about communism as kind of an empty, kind of a horizon, which allows us to populate it through the process, which might be, to go back to Tara's question about radical democracy as a means or as an end. My own view there is that, and this may be a way of trying to tackle what we see as polarization, because it's ultimately connected to questions of distrust, I think, which are quite widespread. But the question of democracy is interesting. And what's interesting is that, for instance, yesterday, when Chantal Mouffe was talking about, she was talking about a recovery. So we're going back to first base. Now, it's not just about certain types of democracy, it's about recovery of democracy. But I would still insist there it's important to be clear about different forms of democracy. And what was interesting is that, for instance, in the debates that we've been having here in Britain around Brexit, and you could say, well, this is like a paradigmatic case of polarization, paralysis, and so on and so forth. But you had recommendations at some points of trying to diffuse that, to try and create some movement, which involved developing and proposing citizen assemblies, for instance. And it was very interesting to see how quickly that was dismissed as an option. And I think that what that shows is that there is a very clear understanding and hegemonic understanding of what democracy is, which is usually and typically reduced to the question of voting or electoral forms of democracy. But I still think it's important to hold on to that, and I would hold on to that as part of the broader narrative, let's say, in thinking about democracy, because one can think about democracy in terms of the different sites of democracy, for instance. The different types of democracy. We can talk about representational democracy, and we can talk about dialogic forms of democracy, but there are also more radical forms of democracy that might be associated with different sites. And one of the most important sites of democracy that is not really thematized so strongly is the workplace. And you can imagine that becoming a key focal point in targeting our efforts at struggles as a process, because there it's again not necessarily wanting to provide a blueprint of how work organizations should be structured, but it's about highlighting how we and pointing out that we are actually living. Most people vote maybe once in a while, but most of our lives are spent in the workplace, and these are situations and sites in which we are not self-governed, and to call ourselves therefore a democracy seems to be odd. And I think that's a very straightforward and very a straightforward point to make, and I think it's a point that I think can be drawn in to a wider narrative. I mean, to go back to the earlier question about competing narratives, I think it's very interesting to see how certain narratives, I mean, it's not so much, we do have competing narratives, so I wouldn't say that let's say, the populist right are the only ones who have narratives. So you have narratives, but I think what you're touching at or trying to capture there is there are also different forms of enjoyment that are connected to these narratives. And I think it does raise a broader question, which is central and can be a central research project for critical fantasy studies, which is about what is this discourse and this narrative from the right? Does it create? Is it one in which the form of enjoyment appears to be more, for lack of a better word, straightforward, easier to tap into? Now, this is kind of a very broad, open statement to make, but it's the kind of thing that I think is important to tackle this question of competing narratives, because it's not just about competing narratives, it's the way that those narratives are structured to make enjoyment possible. I'll leave it there.
Mm-hmm. Good. I won't leave that. No. I think I can't probably speak and chew gum at the same time. I'm going to take this thing about radical democracy, the question, and so means ends. I think the points that's coming out of the Leclerc move approach was, in a sense, partly driven by a sort of putting into question and also the way in which it was being put into question by its own practices, the Jacobin imaginary. That's a central theme of the book, and that was to think about how do you think about social change. The big issue that you're raising here, I think, is about questions of social change. How do we think about social change from a radical democratic point of view, right? And I take hegemony and social strategy was taking aim at the Jacobin imaginary, which had a particular way of thinking about the goal of a left politics, the process of a left politics, and the agent of a left politics. And the goal was going to be communism, a transparent, fully emancipated society. The process was going to be revolution with a capital R, an absolute break in the replacement of one mode of production with another, and a transfer of power, and an agent, which was the agent of a universal class such as the proletariat, which was going to drive change. And I think all three of those elements were questioned in the deconstruction of the Jacobin imaginary. And there I see the radical democracy as a sort of a goal. It's the goal of what a radical democratic politics should be about. The process now was going to be reconceived in terms of hegemonic practices, or radicalizing the Gramscian notion of a war of position, which is a much more complex business than a revolutionary assault on the state and a complete transfer of state power and the destruction of a state apparatus. Hegemonic practices is going to be a much more complicated business with forward movements, progressions, reversals, and all sorts of heterogeneities that are just not captured in a highly simplified view of social change as a capital R revolution. Even the capital R revolutions we've had were not that simple. And they didn't actually end that good, many of them. And an agent was going to be a diversity, that there wasn't going to be a universal agent. The notion that there was some universal social class, I think it's problematic. And again, as Chantal was insisting, that does not mean that working class demands and working class identities would not be part of a radical democratic project. Indeed, in certain contexts, they may be the leading force of a radical democratic project in certain contexts. But that the agency of change was going to be a plurality of actors and demands and identities which were going to be put together into some form of a coalition, some form of an alliance, a hegemonic project, as they called it. And so I see radical democracy is very much a goal of struggle, but democratization, I think if any hegemony worth its name as a left hegemony or a left hegemonic strategy would have to be a democratizing strategy. It would have to challenge different relations of power and domination in different sites. I think the fundamental, a lot of this debate is that I take the fundamental shift that took place was to think that, power wasn't, it's going back to Foucault and many of these thoughts, that power isn't centralized and concentrated just in one institution. It now has become a commonplace to think of that, following a Foucauldian line of thinking, but I think it's an essential starting point that power is dispersed in certainly in advanced capitalist societies. And that poses political social change in a much more complicated way than it would ever be done before. The idea of seizing a state, taking power and smashing it and creating a new state, I just don't see it in an advanced industrial society as going to be a viable or, in fact, desirable strategy, right? So it's going to be much more and that means if it's complicated, there's going to be reversals, and you look back and we think, well, things haven't been that great necessarily. I mean, things are not terrible either, totally terrible, but they're not. They weren't the kinds of prospects that was expected by the radical democratic project that was proposed. But that's, I don't think, to do with the theory. I agree with Chantal. You know, politicians and parties and movements, they have connections to theory, but they're not governed by those theoretical debates. They are governed by their practical projects and how they operate and organize. They are informed to some degree, but they're informed by a diversity of views and traditions. So I don't know, that's my sort of, it's a difficult question. It's a difficult question, I think, to answer in the abstract. I think you've got to start looking at specific societies, at specific sets of social relations, and take in the full complexity of the way society is.
Well,
right?
if I may, do you feel that power is dispersed in the university?
Is it dispersed?
Like that we can't pinpoint where decision making tends to happen and where the implied veto is? I'm just thinking that there's an argument to be made that in terms of political formativity that Foucault leads to a political impotence because we're fighting a consolidated power. They don't have these reservations. They seem to be winning lots of ground.
Yeah,
so,
I mean, they are I would agree. I mean, I don't want to. These are good questions. I agree with you, and there are going to be surely concentrations of power, and there may be at some points be more concentrated than at other points. But I don't think there is the notion of an overarching centralization and concentration of power in a university context. I think it is still much more pluralistic, and there are points of intervention. It may not be that you can produce all the changes you want, but they're not, I wouldn't want to conceptualize them as beyond the pale, that one cannot engage with the institutions, policies and practices of an institution and stand outside of it. I think you have to engage with it. And in fact, there are points where you can produce certain changes. But then our notion of social change is becoming much more complicated. Social change isn't so easy anymore, I don't think. I think that's just a fact. And then how do you come to terms with that? You need strategies and ideas that deal with the complexities. But we may disagree.
I don't know. I don't have the answer.
Yeah. Thank you. It's a great question. It's difficult.
Thank you.
Yeah, I can try and address. Thanks for your question about then what to do when these others, these opponents of ours use our tools against us. I think this is a really important question, and I cannot offer any sure answer because if I could, then my whole talk would have been about that. But some things we can learn from the theory and also from watching how they're doing it. And one, of course, is because they now often successfully manage to, and I'm saying it's very generalized because it's different in different contexts, of course, but how they disarticulate some of our political issues and making them our own. And I think that's something to learn from them. We also need to sort of disarticulate and rearticulate different demands that they are articulating. And another issue is also that I've been thinking about, and I don't have a great answer there either, but it also is linked to what Jason said about enjoyment, because I think there's a risk also that we go into this polarization procuring high sense of enjoyment from it, and I think that is part of what leads us to the deadlock. So that's one issue. I'd like also to say something about, inside or outside the university. And here, this is not a theoretical answer, but I think I found massively inspiring recently what our dismissed colleagues in Turkey are doing. Because what they are doing, those who cannot travel or have chosen to stay because they want to stay and struggle, is that they have created these environments outside of universities where critical thinking can continue to happen. And it's very inspirational, I think, to see that even under those conditions that are not nearly as, being in the liberal university, you can actually do that. So we have a lot to learn from them, in addition to, working in solidarity with them. So, you want to say something?
No, I don't think
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
Before my question, I just wanted to add to the praise lavished on David and Jason already. I think it's fair to say that without their work over the last couple of decades, very few of us would have come to the beautiful city of Colchester. The work they've done building up Essex School as a research program, but also as a community and a family, and the way it's touched our lives beyond academic work is worthy of thanks. So thank you both for your efforts for that. My question is about the future of the Essex School. So you guys have worked on logics in 2007 and critical policy studies and critical populism studies more recently. What are the things that you want to see the next generation of scholars, when you pass the baton on, so to speak, where do you want them to take the Essex School, and where do you kind of envision it going in the future?
Hey, he's just got the microphone there. The future is here.
Thank you.
Yeah, no.
I wanted to ask a question about planetary politics, because I kind of felt some unease these last 2 days by hearing the word populism a lot. And perhaps it's personal, I'm sure it is. But I was also wondering, what is your idea about the discourse from new materialism, feminist scholarships to include non-humans in political processes? And I think if you think about what antagonistic frontier is being constructed by the new right of the US, Brazil, Poland, then it's about gender, or what they call gender ideology. It's about the left, but the third one is very strongly about the environment and about the planet. At the same time, you have a philosopher like Bill Connolly writing about fragility of the planet, facing the planetary. So we just want to evoke a bit of response from the panel, what you think about whether populism is still the right term to talk about a radical democratic politics. Should we construct the people, or should we construct Earth? Thank you.
Thank you for the presentation. I have a question regarding the methodology of the approach. I'm not sure if it's the wrong direction, but I always think without a safe space in Essex and doing the logics approach in academic discipline without a lot of friendly faces, it's always a little bit hard to talk about the methods of the logics approach and to build bridges between different research disciplines and research fields. And I was wondering, it's 12 years since the publication, and of course the approach is changing because a lot of people apply it in different fields, but how we should think about methodological re-articulation of the approach, and at which point we should use it within the approach. So I already think the phantasmic or the critical fantasy studies is some re-articulation of the approach, because it's focusing on this phantasmic logic, but should we be thinking more about how we can change the approach on the level of methods to build bridges to other people, other disciplines, and say you really have a good approach, but maybe you need some sort of help to find the same perspective. And one last point, and it's related. I'm always wondering about the methodological status of the logic of equivalence and logic of difference as political logics. Because we have got now papers that publishing conservatism as political logic, but in the logics approach, that was my interpretation, those both logics, equivalence and difference, always play some sort of method function. And does the other political logics also will play this function?
So, just not clear about the last point, the method function. The other logics don't. Sorry, could you just rephrase a little bit the last bit? Yes. I didn't quite get it. I didn't have to. Yeah.
I mean, can we phrase it as every political logic also something we have to regard from a methodological perspective. Because I'm always thinking about equivalence and difference as logics helps us to find social logics within hegemonic formations. And when you think about other political logics, are they significant for our methodology?
Shall we accept 2 more questions and then leave it at day? Yeah.
Okay?
Yes?
Yeah, sure.
I'm going.
I just have a quick question for Jason. I was really interested in the last 2 words of the. I'm right here, Jason.
Hi.
I was interested in the last 2 words. The first part of your presentation, vanishing mediator. I wanted to ask you to unpack that a little bit in the little time that we have left, because 2 names sort of popped up into my head. When I heard vanishing mediator, I heard Hegel and Friedrich Jameson. And Friedrich Jameson represents, I think, a very interesting crux here, because he's someone who took seriously the Hegelian dialectic expressed in Marxism, but he also coined the term in the early 70s and at least mobilized it to rethink Hegel. So one of the things that Laclau insisted is that populism is not a concept but a name. And so the vanishing mediator, at least under Marxian discourse, constitutes itself in the realm of the concept. So I'm wondering, what is vanishing and what is doing the mediating here, and where is it constituted?
Yes, yesterday Chantal Mouffe said that populism is a strategy. So it will be a strategy to accede to gain power. And so I kind of disagree with the idea that Laclau said that populism is not a concept, because in the populist reason, explicitly he says that he aims to construct a concept of populism, even if populism can be an aim to or a signifier. So do you think that populism is a strategy, or we can have a concept of populism?
The questions are getting deeper, and this would we should have had the session probably at the start of the.
I won't take up too much time because it's David and Jason you really want to hear from. But I was intrigued by the question here: should we construct a people or should we construct the earth? It's a fabulous thought. I think saving the planet for its own sake may be our only recourse in the end. It may be too late for humans, but as somebody who comes from a social policy tradition, I think we shouldn't go away assuming that actually we are even humanising humans. And I think in my field where so many people are disenfranchised, dehumanised, warehoused, let's say that. I mean, with the kind of older people, the sort of things that I'm interested in, people are languishing around in warehouses, or at best, in their homes, hooked up to some kind of remote technological system where they don't see another human from one week to the next. So I think we've got a long way to go in humanising humans first. That's probably not a satisfactory answer, but just a thought.
Can I follow up quickly? I like that question as well. I'll throw a question back, not for you to respond now because we probably don't have time, but it's an interesting one. I mean, on a personal level, first of all, the issue about the climate, the environment, I mean, as Chantal said yesterday, that has to be part of a leftist populist strategy, and I fully agree with that. But the next question is, like, for this to happen, do non-human beings and entities need to be part of the people or the construction of the people? And I'm not sure about that. So one question to consider or to think about, and I'll certainly do so myself, is whether our relationship to non-human beings and entities, is that political or ethical, and how to think that in relation to like this kind of left-wing populist project. So that's my spontaneous reaction. But
I'll make a couple of sentences. So I'm going to speak to Dan's question, which is, and the glib, clever answer is, okay, as I'm one of the elder people in the room, the future is in your hands, in a way, as to which directions these things go, right? And that sounds a bit clever, but there's a sort of truth in it, in the sense that it's the kind of, these programs are dependent on the students who come here and who develop your own projects and the kinds of issues that you confront and how you deal with them. So my two, and it's sort of connected up to the method issue and where we go. So on one level, it's the kinds of issues that the program wants to encourage or is seen to encourage. And in a sense, that comes from people and the things that they're doing in their practices and in their lives and the issues they're dealing with, problematization. But it's shaped by the kinds of studies that get done in the program as well. And maybe that's where the populism issue comes in. And I got a sense that there was Jason made the point of the dangers of psychoanalytic imperialism in terms of explanation. And I think that's right. I think that for me, it's definitely got to be countered with the stress on the political logics. I came to this program, primacy of politics. That's what attracted me to this place, the primacy of politics. Not economic determinism, not other forms, but the primacy. That's what I take as the Gramscian heritage of the approach. So that element's got to be there, but we also need to make sure that there's not a populist imperialism, right? Because we could see everything through the lens of populism, because in one sense, and I haven't been attending some of the populism is multifaceted in the way it's being conceptualized. There's many different predicates that we can attach to the notion of populism. It's a strategy, it's a form of politics, it's a logic of the political, it's a form of the political. It's not as if I don't think there is a chapter and verse story in the work of Laclau and the Essex School on the character of populism. There is a framework, and that framework can get fleshed out in different directions. And then it gets framed out both in terms of explanations, but also in terms of normativity and issues about values and radical democracy. And I have a particular thought about radical democracy and populism. It's not entirely Chantal's view, but I don't disagree either. It's just how you inflect it. It's how you would inflect left populism, okay, for instance. So that I think those are the sorts of, it's partly in the hands, but it's also, and then there's the issue about the methods. That's what I think, in some sense, the survival of our kind of research is also going to be fought on a methodological level. That is, I think, the realization of the logics of critical explanation, because if we want to operate in the academy, that's the terrain in which we operate. And in part, we don't choose that terrain. We can try and shape a bit of it. We can try and find spaces in it to do what we want to do. And we can try and enlarge that space. But ultimately, it's a hegemonic battle. It's a hegemonic battle where we have to find our place in the academy. And it's an increasingly more difficult terrain to operate in, right? So that's where methods is an important aspect, because part of the cultural capital of doing social science is the methods you use, and you can't avoid that. There's a methodological dimension. That's partly what inspired logics of critical explanation. How can we arm ourselves to go and defend and do things in this terrain which is not necessarily wholly congenial to the way we would like to do it, right? So it strikes me that there's issues and problems, and then there's the methods. And that, for me, that's always an issue. People will know when we're doing our PhD discussions, what is your puzzle? What are your core questions? What are your kinds of research strategies? What kind of empirical sources are you going to use? These sorts of methodological questions, they're perennials. And we have to be strong on that field. We've got to be super strong on that field. We've got to be able to defend and be taken seriously. The agonistic respect, this is getting back to Hugh's point there. There's a whole, we can have a long discussion about causal analysis and so on. But the question, it's like democracy, it's like populism. Do you surrender the terrain to the enemy? So do you give up democracy to the forces of the right? I don't want to give up democracy to the forces of the right. Do you want to give up methods to the mainstream positivists? No, I don't want to do that. I want to say we have also methods. And then the question comes, do we give up causal analysis to the positivists? And I'm on the verge of saying no. Right? There's other ways. Don't let them hegemonize causality and take it away from us. It's a terrain we can fight on. Right? We need to be well armed to fight that battle. Right? So let's start thinking about it. So that's sort of, yeah. And I think it partly gets to I think there's more to life than populism. Right?
I could add a few things to that, because in a way, it seems to me that does, going back to the point about causality, because partly what's at stake in taking a position with respect to causality is also thematizing how we understand causality. And one of the key aspects of our intervention was to try and revisit the notion of causality and to think it through the idea of a grammar of intelligibility. It's a very interesting thing. I mean, within the context of the philosophy of science, how causality itself doesn't have the kind of robust character that we, in the social sciences, impute to it. And what's interesting about that is that then it does create a bit of a destabilization, especially when you think about the relationship between discourse on the one hand and discourse as a kind of an approach, and materialism, or the new materialism. And I know Nico's been working in this field, and of course Karen has been working in this field, but it touches on your question about the role, where the planetary and the idea of fragility comes in thinking about it. I mean, a lot of my engagement with new materialism, which I have found very fruitful, comes through the AANT, with Anne-Marie Moll and John Rawls and so on and so forth. So a lot of that had to do with the realm of health. And obviously when you're talking about healthcare, questions of causality, which here I'm going to spin in the direction of mechanisms, and by which I mean processes which do not pass through the subject. Right? So these processes which do not go through the subject, conceived as the subject of the signifier, that are making things happen on the one hand, which are part of our body in the context of healthcare, but yet our body being also the source of meanings, and how we as embodied entities negotiate what is happening in the body through these mechanisms that don't pass through the subject, plus those things that do go through the subject in terms of the meanings that we attribute to it in making sense of our illness, for instance. What am I saying here? What I'm saying is what's interesting is that negotiation of the processes which pass through the subject and which do not pass through the subject, conceived in assemblage, I think that's an incredibly vital domain of research, particularly the way that it springs, it becomes a source of the phantasmatic. I think it's a big challenge to move to big environmental issues, and I think that's a big challenge from the point of view of doing critical fantasy studies, although I would say that the kinds of things that you are working on personally is actually really quite fascinating in terms of the images that are being projected, the obstacles that are being constructed in thinking about policies that could perhaps make some sort of an impact. So I would say that I think it has to do with the problem of methods and problems, to go back to the question of the future and where you see it moving towards the IDA program. I feel that a lot of the stuff, the stuff that I talked about now in critical fantasy studies, where does that come from? In parts it comes out through my own personal interest, but it also comes out of the interest of the students who happen to be here in our program, and also the interactions that I've been having and we've been having together with colleagues and other collaborators in doing research projects. And so it's a kind of a co-constructed project, and I see it as part of the program as a whole. But it does raise a question about what sorts of things we might want to think about prioritizing, even accepting the fact that this is a co-constructed project, let's say. And one of the things that has come out of our own experience, and I know it comes out with material and research that we're doing with Hugh, is how one conceives the problem that animates the research in the first place. David was saying how, you can spend, this is what, research, we as PhD students and as researchers struggle with all the time. So what is the problem exactly, and how to formulate the problem and the puzzle in a way that retains a level of stability that doesn't just vanish after you come back to it a month later and 2 months later. And what I would say is that idea of constructing a problem and being able to delimit different sorts of problems is absolutely crucial. So we can go out thinking there is a problem with the world, and we try to describe and characterize and explain a problem, the problem of neoliberalism, say. But on the other hand, there are other issues and other domains that I think are equally valid. We need to understand the situation or the problem or the context within which we are, but there's also, I think, an imperative to search for exemplars of alternative visions that are actually materialized out there, that can serve as exemplars for alternative visions and for alternative practices. And very often what happens is that we get caught up in trying to characterize the problem. It becomes so dominating in our focus that we forget that there is so much interesting, there's so many interesting practices that are at the margins of dominant practices, which actually deserve to be foregrounded. And I think that's also part, I think, of the project of the IDA program, or at least that's what we try to do. I don't know if there is
Okay, I think that we can talk. Here, joining us in these 2 days that were very important for us, I think, and we hope that they were good for you as well. I want to mention some names because we are talking about the PhD collective, but we don't have the name. So very big shout out for Ryan, Craig, Sebastian, Karin, Jimena,
Kostis.
Who else? Atasid, and their main students that help us a lot in that. Thank you very much to our keynote speakers, Jody Dean, Sandra Mouffe, Karen West, Jenny Gunnarsson, Payne, Hugh Wilmott, I'm not forgetting anybody, our Dean of Social Sciences, Moja Lloyd, and we hope that we will meet each other soon again in some other conferences or workshops or even here, and thank you very much.
Before we go, because I just wanted to, before we shimmy off into the secret garden, I want to make sure that, yes please, I just wanted to say a big thank you to everyone who's here, who turned up, who made it really an amazing experience over these 2 days. But also to say again, I warned you about this earlier, again thanks to the IDA PhD Collective, who were instrumental in making this possible, literally. I mean, we're talking about logistics, we're talking about crisis management, we're talking about, well, design. I think design, logo design, that's a big thing. I think that the handbag will definitely become a collector's item. So don't forget to take one with you. But as a token of our appreciation, I mean, this is for the whole Idea Preaching Collective, but obviously you've been a focal point, and Jimena, but we wanted to just present you as a small token of our appreciation, and I should say not just our appreciation, but also our pride in actually making this possible and super enjoyable. So you, would you take one of these?
Please follow Panos to the secret garden where we have a buffet with food and of course drinks. Thank you so much.